Book the Third, Chapter 8 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Bynum. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 8. She Comes Between Them. Appointed hours for the various domestic events of the day were things unknown at Thorpe Ambrose. Irregular in all his habits, Allan accommodated himself to no stated times, with the solitary exception of dinner time, at any hour of the day or night. He retired to rest early or late, and he rose early or late, exactly as he felt inclined. The servants were forbidden to call him, and Mrs. Gripper was accustomed to improvise the breakfast as she best might, from the time when the kitchen fire was first lighted to the time when the clock stood on the stroke of noon. Toward 9 o'clock on the morning after his return, Midwinter knocked at Allan's door, and on entering the room found it empty. After inquiry among the servants, it appeared that Allan had risen that morning before the man who usually attended on him was up, and that his hot water had been brought to the door by one of the housemaids, who was then still in ignorance of Midwinter's return. Nobody had chanced to see the master, either on the stairs or in the hall. Nobody had heard him ring the bell for breakfast, as usual. In brief, nobody knew anything about him, except what was obviously clear to all, that he was not in the house. Midwinter went out under the great portico. He stood at the head of the flight of steps, considering in which direction he should set forth to look for his friend. Allan's unexpected absence added one more to the disquieting influences which still perplexed his mind. He was in the mood in which trifles irritate a man, and fancies are all powerful to exalt or depress his spirits. The sky was cloudy, and the wind blew in puffs from the south. There was every prospect to weather-wise eyes of coming rain. While Midwinter was still hesitating, one of the grooms passed him on the drive below. The man proved, on being questioned, to be better informed about his master's movements than the servants indoors. He had seen Allan pass the stables more than an hour since, going out by the back way into the park with a nosegay in his hand. A nosegay in his hand? The nosegay hung incomprehensibly on Midwinter's mind as he walked round on the chance of meeting Allan to the back of the house. What does the nosegay mean? He asked himself, with an unintelligible sense of irritation and a petulant kick at a stone that stood in his way. It meant that Allan had been following his impulses as usual. The one pleasant impression left on his mind after his interview with Pedgift Senior was the impression made by the lawyer's account of his conversation with Neelie in the park. The anxiety that he should not misjudge her, which the major's daughter had so earnestly expressed, placed her before Allan's eyes in an irresistibly attractive character, the character of the one person among all his neighbors who had some respect still left for his good opinion. Acutely sensible of his social isolation, now that there was no Midwinter to keep him company in the house, hungering and thirsting in his solitude for a kind word and a friendly look, he began to think more and more regretfully, and more longingly, of the bright young face so pleasantly associated with his first happiest days at Thorpe Ambrose. To be conscious of such a feeling as this was, with a character like Allan's, to act on it headlong, led him where it might. He had gone out on the previous morning to look for Neelie with a peace offering of flowers, but with no very distinct idea of what he should say to her if they met; and failing to find her on the scene of her customary walks, he had characteristically persisted the next morning in making a second attempt with another peace offering on a larger scale. Still ignorant of his friend's return, he was now at some distance from the house, searching the park in a direction which he had not tried yet. After walking out a few hundred yards beyond the stables, and failing to discover any signs of Allan, Midwinter retraced his steps, and waited for his friend's return, pacing slowly to and fro on the little strip of garden ground at the back of the house. From time to time, as he passed it, he looked in absently at the room which had formerly been Mrs. Armadale's, which was now, through his interposition, habitually occupied by her son, the room with the statuette on the bracket, and the French windows opening to the ground, which had once recalled to him the second vision of the dream. The shadow of the man, which Allan had seen standing opposite to him at the long window, the view over a lawn and flower garden, the pattering of the rain against the glass, the stretching out of the Shadow's arm, and the fall of the statue in fragments on the floor, these objects and events of the visionary scene, so vividly present to his memory once, were all superseded by later remembrances now, were all left to fade as they might in the dim background of time. He could pass the room again and again, alone and anxious, and never once think of the boat drifting away in the moonlight, and the night's imprisonment on the wrecked ship. Toward 10 o'clock the well-remembered sound of Allan's voice became suddenly audible in the direction of the stables. In a moment more he was visible from the garden. His second morning's search for Neelie had ended, to all appearance, in a second defeat of his object. The nosegay was still in his hand, and he was resignedly making a present of it to one of the coachman's children. Midwinter impulsively took a step forward toward the stables, and abruptly checked his further progress. Conscious that his position toward his friend was altered already in relation to Miss Gwilt, the first sight of Allan filled his mind with a sudden distrust of the governess's influence over him, which was almost a distrust of himself. He knew that he had set forth from the moors on his return to Thorpe Ambrose with the resolution of acknowledging the passion that had mastered him, and of insisting, if necessary, on a second and a longer absence in the interests of the sacrifice which he was bent on making to the happiness of his friend. What had become of that resolution now? The discovery of Miss Gwilt's altered position, and the declaration that she had voluntarily made of her indifference to Allan, had scattered it to the winds. The first words with which he would have met his friend, if nothing had happened to him on the homeward way, were words already dismissed from his lips. He drew back, as he felt it, and struggled with an instinctive loyalty toward Allan, to free himself at the last moment from the influence of Miss Gwilt. Having disposed of his useless nosegay, Allan passed on into the garden, and the instant he entered it recognized Midwinter with a loud cry of surprise and delight. "Am I awake or dreaming?" he exclaimed, seizing his friend excitably by both hands. "You dear old Midwinter, have you sprung up out of the ground, or have you dropped from the clouds?" It was not till Midwinter had explained the mystery of his unexpected appearance in every particular that Allan could be prevailed on to say a word about himself. When he did speak, he shook his head ruefully, and subdued the hearty loudness of his voice with a preliminary look round to see if the servants were within hearing. "I've learned to be cautious since you went away and left me," said Allan. "My dear fellow, you haven't the least notion what things have happened, and what an awful scrape I'm in at this very moment." "You are mistaken, Allan. I have heard more of what has happened than you suppose." "What? The dreadful mess I'm in with Miss Gwilt? The row with the major? The infernal scandal mongering in the neighborhood? You don't mean to say—" "Yes," interposed Midwinter, quietly. "I have heard of it all." "Good heavens! How? Did you stop at Thorpe Ambrose on your way back? Have you been in the coffee room at the hotel? Have you met Pedgift? Have you dropped into the reading rooms and seen what they call the freedom of the press in the town newspaper?" Midwinter paused before he answered, and looked up at the sky. The clouds had been gathering unnoticed over their heads, and the first raindrops were beginning to fall. "Come in here," said Allan. "We'll go up to breakfast this way." He led Midwinter through the open French window into his own sitting room. The wind blew toward that side of the house, and the rain followed them in. Midwinter, who was last, turned and closed the window. Allan was too eager for the answer which the weather had interrupted to wait for it till they reached the breakfast room. He stopped close at the window, and added two more to his string of questions. "How can you possibly have heard about me and Miss Gwilt?" he asked. "Who told you?" "Miss Gwilt herself," replied Midwinter, gravely. Allan's manner changed the moment the governess's name passed his friend's lips. "I wish you had heard my story first," he said. "Where did you meet with Miss Gwilt?" There was a momentary pause. They both stood at the window, absorbed in the interest of the moment. They both forgot that their contemplated place of shelter from the rain had been the breakfast room upstairs. "Before I answer your question," said Midwinter, a little constrainedly, "I want to ask you something, Allan, on my side. Is it really true that you are in some way concerned in Miss Gwilt's leaving Major Milroy's service?" There was another pause. The disturbance which had begun to appear in Allan's manner palpably increased. "It's a rather long story," he began. I have been taken in, Midwinter. I have been imposed on by a person who, I can't help saying it, who cheated me into promising what I oughtn't to have promised, and doing what I had better not have done. It isn't breaking my promise to tell you. I can trust in your discretion, can't I? You will never say a word, will you?" "Stop!" said Midwinter. "Don't trust me with any secrets which are not your own. If you have given a promise, don't trifle with it, even in speaking to such an intimate friend as I am." He laid his hand gently and kindly on Allan's shoulder. "I can't help seeing that I have made you a little uncomfortable," he went on. "I can't help seeing that my question is not so easy a one to answer as I had hoped and supposed. Shall we wait a little? Shall we go upstairs and breakfast first?" Allan was far too earnestly bent on presenting his conduct to his friend in the right aspect to heed Midwinter's suggestion. He spoke eagerly on the instant, without moving from the window. "My dear fellow, it's a perfectly easy question to answer, only—" he hesitated. "Only it requires what I'm a bad hand at. It requires an explanation." "Do you mean," asked Midwinter, more seriously, but not less gently than before, "that you must first justify yourself, and then answer my question?" "That's it," Allan said, with an air of relief. "You've hit the right nail on the head, just as usual." Midwinter's face darkened for the first time. "I am sorry to hear it," he said, his voice sinking low, and his eyes dropping to the ground as he spoke. The rain was beginning to fall thickly. It swept across the garden, straight on the closed windows, and pattered heavily against the glass. "Sorry," repeated Allan. "My dear fellow, you haven't heard the particulars yet. Wait till I explain the thing first." "You are a bad hand at explanations," said Midwinter, repeating Allan's own words. "Don't place yourself at a disadvantage. Don't explain it." Allan looked at him in silent perplexity and surprise. "You are my friend, my best and dearest friend," Midwinter went on. "I can't bear to let you justify yourself to me as if I was your judge, or as if I doubted you." He looked up again at Allan frankly and kindly as he said those words. "Besides," he resumed, "I think if I look into my memory I can anticipate your explanation. We had a moment's talk before I went away, about some very delicate questions which you proposed putting to Major Milroy. I remember I warned you; I remember I had my misgivings. Should I be guessing right if I guess that those questions have been in some way the means of leading you into a false position? If it is true that you have been concerned in Miss Gwilt's leaving her situation, is it also true, is it only doing you justice to believe, that any mischief for which you are responsible has been mischief innocently done?" "Yes," said Allan, speaking for the first time, a little constrainedly on his side. "It is only doing me justice to say that." He stopped and began drawing lines absently with his finger on the blurred surface of the window pane. "You're not like other people, Midwinter," he resumed suddenly with an effort, "and I should have liked you to have heard the particulars all the same." "I will hear them if you desire it," returned Midwinter. "But I am satisfied, without another word, that you have not willingly been the means of depriving Miss Gwilt of her situation. If that is understood between you and me, I think we need say no more. Besides, I have another question to ask, of much greater importance. A question that has been forced on me by what I saw with my own eyes and heard with my own ears last night." He stopped, recoiling in spite of himself. "Shall we go upstairs first?" he asked, abruptly, leading the way to the door, and trying to gain time. It was useless. Once again, the room which they were both free to leave, the room which one of them had twice tried to leave already, held them as if they were prisoners. Without answering, without even appearing to have heard Midwinter's proposal to go upstairs, Allan followed him mechanically as far as the opposite side of the window. There he stopped. "Midwinter!" he burst out, in a sudden panic of astonishment and alarm, "there seems to be something strange between us. You're not like yourself. What is it?" With his hand on the lock of the door, Midwinter turned and looked back into the room. The moment had come. His haunting fear of doing his friend an injustice had shown itself in a restraint of word, look, and action, which had been marked enough to force its way to Allan's notice. The one course left now, in the dearest interests of the friendship that united them, was to speak at once, and to speak boldly. "There's something strange between us," reiterated Allan. "For God's sake, what is it?" Midwinter took his hand from the door, and came down again to the window, fronting Allan. He occupied the place of necessity which Allan had just left. It was the side of the window on which the statuette stood. The little figure, placed on its projecting bracket, was close by him on his right hand. No signs of change appeared in the stormy sky. The rain still swept slanting across the garden, and pattered heavily against the glass. "Give me your hand, Allan." Allan gave it, and Midwinter held it firmly while he spoke. "There is something strange between us," he said. "There is something to be set right which touches you nearly, and it has not been set right yet. You asked me just now where I met with Miss Gwilt. I met with her on my way back here, upon the high road on the further side of the town. She entreated me to protect her from a man who was following and frightening her. I saw the scoundrel with my own eyes, and I should have laid hands on him if Miss Gwilt herself had not stopped me. She gave a very strange reason for stopping me. She said I didn't know who his employer was." Allan's ruddy color suddenly deepened. He looked aside quickly through the window at the pouring rain. At the same moment their hands fell apart, and there was a pause of silence on either side. Midwinter was the first to speak again. "Later in the evening," he went on, "Miss Gwilt explained herself. She told me two things. She declared that the man whom I had seen following her was a hired spy. I was surprised, but I could not dispute it. She told me next, Allan, what I believe with my whole heart and soul to be a falsehood which has been imposed on her as the truth. She told me that the spy was in your employment." Allan turned instantly from the window, and looked Midwinter full in the face again. "I must explain myself this time," he said, resolutely. The ashy paleness peculiar to him in moments of strong emotion began to show itself on Midwinter's cheeks. "More explanations," he said, and drew back a step, with his eyes fixed in a sudden terror of inquiry on Allan's face. "You don't know what I know, Midwinter. You don't know that what I have done has been done with a good reason. And what is more, I have not trusted to myself. I have had good advice." "Did you hear what I said just now?" said Midwinter, incredulously. "You can't, surely, you can't have been attending to me?" "I haven't missed a word," rejoined Allan. "I tell you again, you don't know what I know of Miss Gwilt. She has threatened Miss Milroy. Miss Milroy is in danger while her governess stops in this neighborhood." Midwinter dismissed the major's daughter from the conversation with a contemptuous gesture of his hand. "I don't want to hear about Miss Milroy," he said. "Don't mix up Miss Milroy. Good God, Allan, am I to understand that the spy set to watch Miss Gwilt was doing his vile work with your approval? Once and for all, my dear fellow, will you or will you not let me explain?" "Explain!" cried Midwinter, his eyes aflame, and his hot Creole blood rushing crimson into his face. "Explain the employment of a spy? What, after having driven Miss Gwilt out of her situation by meddling with her private affairs, you meddle again by the vilest of all means, the means of a paid spy? You set a watch on the woman whom you yourself told me you loved, only a fortnight since, the woman you were thinking of as your wife. I don't believe it! I don't believe it! Is my head failing me? Is it Allan Armadale I am speaking to? Is it Allan Armadale's face looking at me? Stop! You are acting under some mistaken scruple. Some low fellow has crept into your confidence, and has done this in your name without telling you first." Allan controlled himself with admirable patience and admirable consideration for the temper of his friend. "If you persist in refusing to hear me," he said, "I must wait as well as I can till my turn comes. Tell me you are a stranger to the employment of that man, and I will hear you willingly. Suppose there should be a necessity that you know nothing about for employing him. I acknowledge no necessity for the cowardly persecution of a helpless woman." A momentary flush of irritation, momentary and no more, passed over Allan's face. "You mightn't think her quite so helpless," he said, "if you knew the truth." "Are you the man to tell the truth?" retorted the other. "You who have refused to hear her in her own defense? You who have closed the doors of this house against her?" Allan still controlled himself, but the effort began at last to be visible. "I know your temper is a hot one," he said, "but for all that your violence quite takes me by surprise. I can't account for it unless—" He hesitated for a moment, and then finished the sentence in his usual frank, outspoken way. "Unless you are sweet yourself on Miss Gwilt." Those last words heaped fuel on the fire. They stripped the truth instantly of all concealments and disguises, and laid it bare to view. Allan's instinct had guessed, and the guiding influence stood revealed of Midwinter's interest in Miss Gwilt. "What right have you to say that?" he asked, with raised voice and threatening eyes. "I told you," said Allan, simply, "when I thought I was sweet on her myself. Come, come! It's a little hard, I think, even if you are in love with her, to believe everything she tells you, and not to let me say a word. Is that the way you decide between us?" "Yes, it is!" cried the other, infuriated by Allan's second allusion to Miss Gwilt. "When I am asked to choose between the employer of a spy and the victim of a spy, I side with the victim." "Don't try me too hard, Midwinter. I have a temper to lose as well as you." He stopped, struggling with himself. The torture of passion in Midwinter's face, from which a less simple and less generous nature might have recoiled in horror, touched Allan suddenly with an artless distress, which at that moment was little less than sublime. He advanced, with his eyes moistening and his hand held out. "You asked me for my hand just now," he said, "and I gave it you. Will you remember old times, and give me yours before it's too late?" "No!" retorted Midwinter, furiously. "I may meet Miss Gwilt again, and I may want my hand free to deal with your spy." He had drawn back along the wall as Allan advanced, until the bracket which supported the statuette was before instead of behind him. In the madness of his passion he saw nothing but Allan's face confronting him. In the madness of his passion he stretched out his right hand as he answered, and shook it threateningly in the air. It struck the forgotten projection of the bracket, and the next instant the statuette lay in fragments on the floor. The rain drove slanting over flower bed and lawn, and pattered heavily against the glass, and the two Armadales stood by the window, as the two shadows had stood in the second vision of the dream, with the wreck of the image between them. Allan stooped over the fragments of the little figure, and lifted them one by one from the floor. "Leave me," he said, without looking up, "or we shall both repent it." Without a word, Midwinter moved back slowly. He stood for the second time with his hand on the door, and looked his last at the room. The horror of the night on the wreck had got him once more, and the flame of his passion was quenched in an instant. "The dream!" he whispered under his breath. "The dream again!" The door was tried from the outside, and a servant appeared with a trivial message about the breakfast. Midwinter looked at the man with a blank, dreadful helplessness in his face. "Show me the way out," he said. "The place is dark, and the room turns round with me." The servant took him by the arm, and silently led him out. As the door closed on them, Allan picked up the last fragment of the broken figure. He sat down alone at the table, and hid his face in his hands. The self-control which he had bravely preserved under exasperation renewed again and again now failed him at last in the friendless solitude of his room. And in the first bitterness of feeling that Midwinter had turned against him like the rest, he burst into tears. The moments followed each other. The slow time wore on. Little by little the signs of a new elemental disturbance began to show themselves in the summer storm. The shadow of a swiftly deepening darkness swept over the sky. The pattering of the rain lessened with the lessening wind. There was a momentary hush of stillness. Then, on a sudden, the rain poured down again like a cataract, and the low roll of thunder came up solemnly on the dying air. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book the Third, Chapter 9. She Knows the Truth. 1. From Mr. Bashwood to Miss Gwilt. Thorpe Ambrose, July the 20th, 1851. Dear Madam, I received yesterday by private messenger your obliging note, in which you direct me to communicate with you through the post only, as long as there is reason to believe that any visitors who may come to you are likely to be observed. May I be permitted to say that I look forward with respectful anxiety to the time when I shall again enjoy the only real happiness I have ever experienced, the happiness of personally addressing you. In compliance with your desire that I should not allow this day, the Sunday, to pass without privately noticing what went on at the great house, I took the keys, and went this morning to the steward's office. I accounted for my appearance to the servants by informing them that I had work to do which was important to complete in the shortest possible time. The same excuse would have done for Mr. Armadale if we had met, but no such meeting happened. Although I was at Thorpe Ambrose in what I thought good time, I was too late to see or hear anything myself of a serious quarrel which appeared to have taken place, just before I arrived, between Mr. Armadale and Mr. Midwinter. All the little information I can give you in this matter is derived from one of the servants. The man told me that he heard the voices of the two gentlemen loud in Mr. Armadale's sitting-room. He went in to announce breakfast shortly afterward, and found Mr. Midwinter in such a dreadful state of agitation that he had to be helped out of the room. The servant tried to take him upstairs to lie down and compose himself. He declined, saying he would wait a little first in one of the lower rooms, and begging that he might be left alone. The man had hardly got downstairs again when he heard the front door opened and closed. He ran back, and found that Mr. Midwinter was gone. The rain was pouring at the time, and thunder and lightning came soon afterward. Dreadful weather, certainly, to go out in. The servant thinks Mr. Midwinter's mind was unsettled. I sincerely hope not. Mr. Midwinter is one of the few people I have met with in the course of my life who have treated me kindly. Hearing that Mr. Armadale still remained in the sitting-room, I went into the steward's office, which, as you may remember, is on the same side of the house, and left the door ajar and set the window open, waiting and listening for anything that might happen. Dear madam, there was a time when I might have thought such a position in the house of my employer not a very becoming one. Let me hasten to assure you that this is far from being my feeling now. I glory in any position which makes me serviceable to you. The state of the weather seemed hopelessly adverse to that renewal of intercourse between Mr. Armadale and Miss Milroy, which you so confidently anticipate, and of which you are so anxious to be made aware. Strangely enough, however, it is actually in consequence of the state of the weather that I am now in a position to give you the very information you require. Mr. Armadale and Miss Milroy met about an hour since. The circumstances were as follows. Just at the beginning of the thunderstorm, I saw one of the grooms run across from the stables, and heard him tap at his master's window. Mr. Armadale opened the window and asked what was the matter. The groom said he came with a message from the coachman's wife. She had seen from her room over the stables, which looks out on to the park, Miss Milroy quite alone, standing for shelter under one of the trees. As that part of the park was at some distance from the major's cottage, she had thought that her master might wish to send and ask the young lady into the house, especially as she had placed herself, with a thunderstorm coming on, in what might turn out to be a very dangerous position. The moment Mr. Armadale understood the man's message, he called for the waterproof things and the umbrellas, and ran out himself, instead of leaving it to the servants. In a little time he and the groom came back with Miss Milroy between them, as well protected as could be from the rain. I ascertained from one of the women servants, who had taken the young lady into a bedroom, and had supplied her with such dry things as she wanted, that Miss Milroy had been afterwards shown into the drawing-room, and that Mr. Armadale was there with her. The only way of following your instructions and finding out what passed between them was to go round the house in the pelting rain and get into the conservatory, which opens into the drawing-room by the outer door. I hesitate at nothing, dear madam, in your service. I would cheerfully get wet every day to please you. Besides, though I may at first sight be thought rather an elderly man, a wetting is of no very serious consequence to me. I assure you I am not so old as I look, and I am of a stronger constitution than appears. It was impossible for me to get near enough in the conservatory to see what went on in the drawing-room, without the risk of being discovered. But most of the conversation reached me, except when they dropped their voices. This is the substance of what I heard. I gathered that Miss Milroy had been prevailed on against her will to take refuge from the thunderstorm in Mr. Armadale's house. She said so, at least, and she gave two reasons. The first was that her father had forbidden all intercourse between the cottage and the great house. Mr. Armadale met this objection by declaring that her father had issued his orders under a total misconception of the truth, and by entreating her not to treat him as cruelly as the Major had treated him. He entered, I suspect, into some explanations at this point, but as he dropped his voice I am unable to say what they were. His language, when I did hear it, was confused and ungrammatical. It seemed, however, to be quite intelligible enough to persuade Miss Milroy that her father had been acting under a mistaken impression of the circumstances. At least I infer this, for when I next heard the conversation, the young lady was driven back to her second objection to being in the house, which was that Mr. Armadale had behaved very badly to her, and that he richly deserved that she should never speak to him again. In this latter case Mr. Armadale attempted no defence of any kind. He agreed with her that he had behaved badly. He agreed with her that he richly deserved she should never speak to him again. At the same time he implored her to remember that he had suffered his punishment already. He was disgraced in the neighbourhood, and his dearest friend, his one intimate friend in the world, had that very morning turned against him like the rest. Far or near there was not a living creature whom he was fond of to comfort him or to say a friendly word to him. He was lonely and miserable, and his heart ached for a little kindness, and that was his only excuse for asking Miss Milroy to forget and forgive the past. I must leave you, I fear, to judge for yourself of the effect of this on the young lady, for, though I tried hard, I failed to catch what she said. I am almost certain I heard her crying, and Mr. Armadale entreating her not to break his heart. They whispered a great deal, which aggravated me. I was afterward alarmed by Mr. Armadale coming out into the conservatory to pick some flowers. He did not come as far, fortunately, as the place where I was hidden, and he went in again into the drawing-room, and there was more talking, I suspect at close quarters, which to my great regret I again failed to catch. Pray forgive me for having so little to tell you. I can only add that when the storm cleared off, Miss Milroy went away with the flowers in her hand, and with Mr. Armadale escorting her from the house. My own humble opinion is that he had a powerful friend at court, all through the interview, in the young lady's own liking for him. This is all I can say at present, with the exception of one other thing I heard which I blush to mention. But your word is law, and you have ordered me to have no concealments from you. Their talk turned once, dear madam, on yourself. I think I heard the word creature from Miss Milroy, and I am certain that Mr. Armadale, while acknowledging that he had once admired you, added that circumstances had since satisfied him of his folly. I quote his own expression. It made me quite tremble with indignation. If I may be permitted to say so, the man who admires Miss Gwilt lives in paradise. Respect, if nothing else, ought to have closed Mr. Armadale's lips. He is my employer, I know; but after his calling it an act of folly to admire you, though I am his deputy steward, I utterly despise him. Trusting that I may have been so happy as to give you satisfaction thus far, and earnestly desirous to deserve the honour of your continued confidence in me, I remain, dear madam, your grateful and devoted servant, Felix Bashwood. 2. From Mrs. Oldershaw to Miss Gwilt. Diana Street, Monday, July the 21st. My dear Lydia, I trouble you with a few lines. They are written under a sense of the duty which I owe to myself in our present position toward each other. I am not at all satisfied with the tone of your last 2 letters, and I am still less pleased at your leaving me this morning without any letter at all, and this when we had arranged, in the doubtful state of our prospects, that I was to hear from you every day. I can only interpret your conduct in one way. I can only infer that matters at Thorpe Ambrose, having been all mismanaged, are all going wrong. It is not my present object to reproach you, for why should I waste time, language, and paper? I merely wish to recall to your memory certain considerations which you appear to be disposed to overlook. Shall I put them in the plainest English? Yes, for with all my faults I am frankness personified. In the first place, then, I have an interest in your becoming Mrs. Armadale of Thorpe Ambrose as well as you. Secondly, I have provided you, to say nothing of good advice, with all the money needed to accomplish our object. Thirdly, I hold your notes of hand at short dates for every farthing so advanced. Fourthly and lastly, though I am indulgent to a fault in the capacity of a friend, in the capacity of a woman of business, my dear, I am not to be trifled with. That is all, Lydia, at least for the present. Pray don't suppose I write in anger. I am only sorry and disheartened. My state of mind resembles David's. If I had the wings of a dove, I would flee away and be at rest. Affectionately yours, Maria Oldershaw. 3. From Mr. Bashwood to Miss Gwilt. Thorpe Ambrose, July the 21st. Dear Madam, you will probably receive these lines a few hours after my yesterday's communication reaches you. I posted my first letter last night, and I shall post this before noon today. My present object in writing is to give you some more news from this house. I have the inexpressible happiness of announcing that Mr. Armadale's disgraceful intrusion on your privacy is at an end. The watch set on your actions is to be withdrawn this day. I write, dear madam, with the tears in my eyes, tears of joy caused by feelings which I ventured to express in my previous letter. See first paragraph toward the end. Pardon me this personal reference. I can speak to you, I don't know why, so much more readily with my pen than with my tongue. Let me try to compose myself and proceed with my narrative. I had just arrived at the steward's office this morning when Mr. Pedgift the elder followed me to the great house to see Mr. Armadale by special appointment. It is needless to say that I at once suspended any little business there was to do, feeling that your interests might possibly be concerned. It is also most gratifying to add that this time circumstances favoured me. I was able to stand under the open window and to hear the whole interview. Mr. Armadale explained himself at once in the plainest terms. He gave orders that the person who had been hired to watch you should be instantly dismissed. On being asked to explain this sudden change of purpose, he did not conceal that it was owing to the effect produced on his mind by what had passed between Mr. Midwinter and himself on the previous day. Mr. Midwinter's language, cruelly unjust as it was, had nevertheless convinced him that no necessity whatever could excuse any proceeding so essentially base in itself as the employment of a spy, and on that conviction he was now determined to act. But for your own positive directions to me to conceal nothing that passes here in which your name is concerned, I should really be ashamed to report what Mr. Pedgift said on his side. He has behaved kindly to me, I know, but if he was my own brother I could never forgive him the tone in which he spoke of you, and the obstinacy with which he tried to make Mr. Armadale change his mind. He began by attacking Mr. Midwinter. He declared that Mr. Midwinter's opinion was the very worst opinion that could be taken, for it was quite plain that you, dear madam, had twisted him round your finger. Producing no effect by this coarse suggestion, which nobody who knows you could for a moment believe, Mr. Pedgift next referred to Miss Milroy, and asked Mr. Armadale if he had given up all idea of protecting her. What this meant I cannot imagine. I can only report it for your private consideration. Mr. Armadale briefly answered that he had his own plan for protecting Miss Milroy, and that the circumstances were altered in that quarter, or words to a similar effect. Still Mr. Pedgift persisted. He went on, I blush to mention, from bad to worse. He tried to persuade Mr. Armadale next to bring an action at law against one or other of the persons who had been most strongly condemning his conduct in the neighbourhood, for the purpose, I really hardly know how to write it, of getting you into the witness box. And worse yet, when Mr. Armadale still said no, Mr. Pedgift, after having, as I suspected by the sound of his voice, been on the point of leaving the room, artfully came back and proposed sending for a detective officer from London, simply to look at you. "The whole of this mystery about Miss Gwilt's true character," he said, "may turn on a question of identity. It won't cost much to have a man down from London, and it's worth trying whether her face is or is not known at headquarters to the police." I again and again assure you, dearest lady, that I only repeat those abominable words from a sense of duty toward yourself. I shook, I declare I shook from head to foot when I heard them. To resume, for there is more to tell you. Mr. Armadale, to his credit, I don't deny it, though I don't like him, still said no. He appeared to be getting irritated under Mr. Pedgift's persistence, and he spoke in a somewhat hasty way. "You persuaded me on the last occasion when we talked about this," he said, "to do something that I have been since heartily ashamed of. You won't succeed in persuading me, Mr. Pedgift, a second time." Those were his words. Mr. Pedgift took him up short. Mr. Pedgift seemed to be nettled on his side. "If that is the light in which you see my advice, sir," he said, "the less you have of it for the future, the better. Your character and position are publicly involved in this matter between yourself and Miss Gwilt, and you persist, at a most critical moment, in taking a course of your own, which I believe will end badly. After what I have already said and done in this very serious case, I can't consent to go on with it with both my hands tied, and I can't drop it with credit to myself while I remain publicly known as your solicitor. You leave me no alternative, sir, but to resign the honour of acting as your legal adviser." "I am sorry to hear it," says Mr. Armadale, "but I have suffered enough already through interfering with Miss Gwilt. I can't and won't stir any further in the matter." "You may not stir any further in it, sir," said Mr. Pedgift, "and I shall not stir any further in it. for it has ceased to be a question of professional interest to me. But mark my words, Mr. Armadale, you are not at the end of this business yet. Some other person's curiosity may go on from the point where you and I have stopped, and some other person's hand may let the broad daylight in yet on Miss Gwilt. I report their language, dear madam, almost word for word, I believe, as I heard it. It produced an indescribable impression on me. It filled me, I hardly know why, with quite a panic of alarm. I don't at all understand it, and I understand still less what happened immediately afterward. Mr. Pedgift's voice, when he said those last words, sounded dreadfully close to me. He must have been speaking at the open window, and he must, I fear, have seen me under it. I had time, before he left the house, to get out quietly from among the laurels, but not to get back to the office. Accordingly I walked away along the drive toward the lodge, as if I was going on some errand connected with the steward's business. Before long Mr. Pedgift overtook me in his gig, and stopped. "So you feel some curiosity about Miss Gwilt, do you?" he said. "Gratify your curiosity by all means. I don't object to it." I felt naturally nervous, but I managed to ask him what he meant. He didn't answer. He only looked down at me from the gig in a very odd manner, and laughed. "I have known stranger things happen even than that," he said to himself suddenly, and drove off. I have ventured to trouble you with this last incident, though it may seem of no importance in your eyes, in the hope that your superior ability may be able to explain it. My own poor faculties, I confess, are quite unable to penetrate Mr. Pedgift's meaning. All I know is that he has no right to accuse me of any such impertinent feeling as curiosity in relation to a lady whom I ardently esteem and admire. I dare not put it in warmer words. I have only to add that I am in a position to be of continued service to you here, if you wish it. Mr. Armadale has just been into the office, and has told me briefly that in Mr. Midwinter's continued absence I am still to act as steward's deputy till further notice. Believe me, dear madam, anxiously and devotedly yours, Felix Bashwood. 4. From Allan Armadale to the Reverend Decimus Brock. Thorpe Ambrose, Tuesday. My dear Mr. Brock, I am in sad trouble. Midwinter has quarrelled with me and left me, and my lawyer has quarrelled with me and left me, and, except dear little Miss Milroy, who has forgiven me, all the neighbours have turned their backs on me. There is a good deal about me in this, but I can't help it. I am very miserable alone in my own house. Do pray come and see me. You are the only old friend I have left, and I do long so to tell you about it. N.B. On my word of honour as a gentleman, I am not to blame. Yours affectionately, Allan Armadale. P.S. I would come to you, for this place has grown quite hateful to me, but I have a reason for not going too far away from Miss Milroy just at present. 5. From Robert Stapleton to Allan Armadale, Esquire. Bascombe Rectory, Thursday morning. Respected Sir, I see a letter in your writing on the table along with the others, which I am sorry to say my master is not well enough to open. He is down with a sort of low fever. The doctor says it has been brought on by worry and anxiety, which the master was not strong enough to bear. This seems likely, for I was with him when he went to London last month, and what with his own business and the business of looking after that person who afterward gave us the slip, he was worried and anxious all the time, and for the matter of that, so was I. My master was talking of you a day or two since. He seemed unwilling that you should know of his illness unless he got worse. But I think you ought to know of it. At the same time he is not worse, perhaps a trifle better. The doctor says he must be kept very quiet and not agitated on any account. So be pleased to take no notice of this. I mean in the way of coming to the rectory. I have the doctor's orders to say it is not needful, and it would only upset my master in the state he is in now. I will write again if you wish it. Please accept of my duty, and believe me to remain, sir, your humble servant, Robert Stapleton. P.S. The yacht has been rigged and repainted, waiting your orders. She looks beautiful. 6. From Mrs. Oldershaw to Miss Gwilt. Diana Street, July the 24th. Miss Gwilt. The post hour has passed for 3 mornings following, and has brought me no answer to my letter. Are you purposely bent on insulting me, or have you left Thorpe Ambrose? In either case I won't put up with your conduct any longer. The law shall bring you to book if I can't. Your first note of hand for £30 falls due on Tuesday next, the 29th. If you had behaved with common consideration towards me, I would have let you renew it with pleasure. As things are, I shall have the note presented, and if it is not paid, I shall instruct my man of business to take the usual course. Yours, Maria Oldershaw. 7. From Miss Gwilt to Mrs. Oldershaw. 5 Paradise Place, Thorpe Ambrose, July the 25th. Mrs. Oldershaw. The time of your man of business being, no doubt, of some value, I write a line to assist him when he takes the usual course. He will find me waiting to be arrested in the first-floor apartments at the above address. In my present situation, and with my present thoughts, the best service you can possibly render me is to lock me up. L.G. 8. From Mrs. Oldershaw to Miss Gwilt. Diana Street, July the 26th. My darling Lydia, the longer I live in this wicked world, the more plainly I see that women's own tempers are the worst enemies women have to contend with. What a truly regretful style of correspondence we have fallen into! What a sad want of self-restraint, my dear, on your side and on mine! Let me, as the oldest in years, be the first to make the needful excuses, the first to blush for my own want of self-control. Your cruel neglect, Lydia, stung me into writing as I did. I am so sensitive to ill-treatment when it is inflicted on me by a person whom I love and admire, and though turned 60, I am still, unfortunately for myself, so young at heart. Accept my apologies for having made use of my pen, when I ought to have been content to take refuge in my pocket handkerchief. Forgive your attached Maria for being still young at heart. But, oh, my dear, though I own I threatened you, how hard of you to take me at my word! How cruel of you, if your debt had been 10 times what it is, to suppose me capable, whatever I might say, of the odious inhumanity of arresting my bosom friend. Heavens, have I deserved to be taken at my word in this unmercifully exact way, after the years of tender intimacy that have united us? But I don't complain. I only mourn over the frailty of our common human nature. Let us expect as little of each other as possible, my dear. We are both women, and we can't help it. I declare, when I reflect on the origin of our unfortunate sex, when I remember that we were all originally made of no better material than the rib of a man, and that rib of so little importance to its possessor that he never appears to have missed it afterward. I am quite astonished at our virtues, and not in the least surprised at our faults. I am wandering a little. I am losing myself in serious thought, like that sweet character in Shakespeare, who was fancy-free. One last word, dearest, to say that my longing for an answer to this proceeds entirely from my wish to hear from you again in your old friendly tone, and is quite unconnected with any curiosity to know what you are doing at Thorpe Ambrose, except such curiosity as you yourself might approve. Need I add that I beg you as a favour to me to renew, on the customary terms? I refer to the little bill due on Tuesday next, and I venture to suggest that day 6 weeks. Yours with a truly motherly feeling, Maria Oldershaw. 9. From Miss Gwilt to Mrs. Oldershaw. Paradise Place, July the 27th. I have just got your last letter. The brazen impudence of it has roused me. I am to be treated like a child, am I? To be threatened first, and then, if threatening fails, to be coaxed afterward. You shall coax me. You shall know, my motherly friend, the sort of child you have to deal with. I had a reason, Mrs. Oldershaw, for the silence which has so seriously offended you. I was afraid, actually afraid, to let you into the secret of my thoughts. No such fear troubles me now. My only anxiety this morning is to make you my best acknowledgments for the manner in which you have written to me. After carefully considering it, I think the worst turn I can possibly do you is to tell you what you are burning to know. So here I am at my desk, bent on telling it. If you don't bitterly repent when you are at the end of this letter, not having held to your first resolution, and locked me up out of harm's way while you had the chance, my name is not Lydia Gwilt. End of Chapter 9, Part 1. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. The third, Chapter 9, Part 2, of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book the third, Chapter 9, Part 2. Where did my last letter end? I don't remember, and don't care. Make it out as you can. I'm not going back any further than this day week. That is to say, Sunday last. There was a thunderstorm in the morning. It began to clear off toward noon. I didn't go out. I waited to see Midwinter or to hear from him. Are you surprised at my not writing Mr. before his name? We have got so familiar, my dear, that Mr. would be quite out of place. He had left me the evening before, under very interesting circumstances. I had told him that his friend Armadale was persecuting me by means of a hired spy. He had declined to believe it, and had gone straight to Thorpe Ambrose to clear the thing up. I let him kiss my hand before he went. He promised to come back the next day, the Sunday. I felt I had secured my influence over him, and I believed he would keep his word. Well, the thunder passed away as I told you. The weather cleared up, the people walked out in their best clothes, the dinners came in from the baker's. I sat dreaming at my wretched little hired piano, nicely dressed and looking my best, and still no Midwinter appeared. It was late in the afternoon, and I was beginning to feel offended, when a letter was brought to me. It had been left by a strange messenger who went away again immediately. I looked at the letter. Midwinter at last. In writing instead of in person. I began to feel more offended than ever, for, as I told you, I thought I had used my influence over him to better purpose. The letter, when I read it, set my mind off in a new direction. It surprised, it puzzled, it interested me. I thought and thought and thought of him all the rest of the day. He began by asking my pardon for having doubted what I told him. Mr. Armadale's own lips had confirmed me. They had quarrelled, as I had anticipated they would, and he and the man who had once been his dearest friend on earth had parted for ever. So far I was not surprised. I was amused by his telling me in his extravagant way that he and his friend were parted for ever, and I rather wondered what he would think when I carried out my plan and found my way into the great house on pretence of reconciling them. But the second part of the letter set me thinking. Here it is, in his own words. It is only by struggling against myself, and no language can say how hard the struggle has been, that I have decided on writing instead of speaking to you. A merciless necessity claims my future life. I must leave Thorpe Ambrose. I must leave England, without hesitating, without stopping to look back. There are reasons, terrible reasons, which I have madly trifled with, for my never letting Mr. Armadale set eyes on me or hear of me again after what has happened between us. I must go, never more to live under the same roof, never more to breathe the same air with that man. I must hide myself from him under an assumed name. I must put the mountains and the seas between us. I have been warned as no human creature was ever warned before. I believe, I dare not tell you why, I believe that if the fascination you have for me draws me back to you, fatal consequences will come of it to the man whose life has been so strangely mingled with your life and mine, the man who was once your admirer and my friend. And yet, feeling this, seeing it in my mind as plainly as I see the sky above my head, there is a weakness in me that still shrinks from the one imperative sacrifice of never seeing you again. I am fighting with it as a man fights with the strength of his despair. I have been near enough, not an hour since, to see the house where you live, and have forced myself away again out of sight of it. Can I force myself away further still, now that my letter is written? Now, when the useless confession escapes me, and I own to loving you with the first love I have ever known, with the last love I shall ever feel? Let the coming time answer the question. I dare not write of it or think of it more. Those were the last words. In that strange way the letter ended. I felt a perfect fever of curiosity to know what he meant. His loving me, of course, was easy enough to understand. But what did he mean by saying he had been warned? Why was he never to live under the same roof, never to breathe the same air again with young Armadale? What sort of quarrel could it be which obliged one man to hide himself from another under an assumed name, and to put the mountains and the seas between them? Above all, if he came back and let me fascinate him, why should it be fatal to the hateful lout who possesses the noble fortune and lives in the great house? I never longed in my life as I longed to see him again and put these questions to him. I got quite superstitious about it as the day drew on. They gave me a sweetbread and a cherry pudding for dinner. I actually tried if he would come back by the stones in the plate. He will, he won't. He will, he won't, and so on. It ended in he won't. I rang the bell and had the things taken away. I contradicted destiny quite fiercely. I said, he will, and I waited at home for him. You don't know what a pleasure it is to me to give you all these little particulars. Count up, my bosom friend, my second mother, count up the money you have advanced on the chance of my becoming Mrs. Armadale, and then think of my feeling this breathless interest in another man. Oh, Mrs. Oldershaw, how intensely I enjoy the luxury of irritating you. The day got on toward evening. I rang again and sent down to borrow a railway timetable. What trains were there to take him away on Sunday? The national respect for the Sabbath stood my friend. There was only one train, which had started hours before he wrote to me. I went and consulted my glass. It paid me the compliment of contradicting the divination by cherry stones. My glass said, "Get behind the window curtain. He won't pass the long, lonely evening without coming back again to look at the house." I got behind the window curtain and waited with his letter in my hand. The dismal Sunday light faded, and the dismal Sunday quietness in the street grew quieter still. The dusk came, and I heard a step coming with it in the silence. My heart gave a little jump. Only think of my having any heart left! I said to myself, Midwinter, and Midwinter it was. When he came in sight he was walking slowly, stopping and hesitating at every 2 or 3 steps. My ugly little drawing-room window seemed to be beckoning him on, in spite of himself. After waiting till I saw him come to a standstill, a little aside from the house, but still within view of my irresistible window, I put on my things, and slipped out by the back way into the garden. The landlord and his family were at supper, and nobody saw me. I opened the door in the wall, and got round by the lane into the street. At that awkward moment I suddenly remembered what I had forgotten before. The spy set to watch me, who was no doubt waiting somewhere in sight of the house. It was necessary to get time to think, and it was, in my state of mind, impossible to let Midwinter go without speaking to him. In great difficulties you generally decide at once, if you decide at all. I decided to make an appointment with him for the next evening, and to consider in the interval how to manage the interview so that it might escape observation. This, as I felt at the time, was leaving my own curiosity free to torment me for 24 mortal hours. But what other choice had I? It was as good as giving up being the mistress of Thorpe Ambrose altogether, to come to a private understanding with Midwinter in the sight and possibly in the hearing of Armadale's spy. Finding an old letter of yours in my pocket, I drew back into the lane, and wrote on the blank leaf with a little pencil that hangs at my watch-chain. I must and will speak to you. It is impossible tonight, but be in the street tomorrow at this time, and leave me afterward forever if you like. When you have read this, overtake me, and say as you pass, without stopping or looking round, 'Yes, I promise.'" I folded up the paper and came on him suddenly from behind. As he started and turned round, I put the note into his hand, pressed his hand, and passed on. Before I had taken 10 steps I heard him behind me. I can't say he didn't look round. I saw his big black eyes, bright and glittering in the dusk, devour me from head to foot in a moment. But otherwise he did what I told him. "I can deny you nothing," he whispered. "I promise." I couldn't help thinking at the time how that brute and booby, Armadale, would have spoiled everything in the same situation. I tried hard all night to think of a way of making our interview of the next evening safe from discovery, and tried in vain. Even as early as this I began to feel as if Midwinter's letter had in some unaccountable manner stupefied me. Monday morning made matters worse. News came from my faithful ally, Mr. Bashwood, that Miss Milroy and Armadale had met and become friends again. You may fancy the state I was in. An hour or two later there came more news from Mr. Bashwood. Good news this time. The mischievous idiot at Thorpe Ambrose had shown sense enough at last to be ashamed of himself. He had decided on withdrawing the spy that very day, and he and his lawyer had quarrelled in consequence. So here was the obstacle which I was too stupid to remove for myself, obligingly removed for me. No more need to fret about the coming interview with Midwinter, and plenty of time to consider my next proceedings, now that Miss Milroy and her precious swain had come together again. Would you believe it, the letter, or the man himself, I don't know which, had taken such a hold on me, that though I tried and tried, I could think of nothing else. And this when I had every reason to fear that Miss Milroy was in a fair way of changing her name to Armadale, and when I knew that my heavy debt of obligation to her was not paid yet. Was there ever such perversity? I can't account for it, can you? The dusk of the evening came at last. I looked out of the window, and there he was. I joined him at once, the people of the house, as before, being too much absorbed in their eating and drinking to notice anything else. "We mustn't be seen together here," I whispered. "I must go on first, and you must follow me." He said nothing in the way of reply. What was going on in his mind I can't pretend to guess, but after coming to his appointment he actually hung back as if he was half inclined to go away again. "You look as if you were afraid of me," I said. "I am afraid of you," he answered, "of you and of myself." It was not encouraging. It was not complimentary. But I was in such a frenzy of curiosity by this time that if he had been ruder still, I should have taken no notice of it. I led the way a few steps toward the new buildings, and stopped and looked round after him. "Must I ask it of you as a favour," I said, "after your giving me your promise, and after such a letter as you have written to me?" Something suddenly changed him. He was at my side in an instant. "I beg your pardon, Miss Gwilt. Lead the way where you please." He dropped back a little after that answer, and I heard him say to himself, "What is to be will be. What have I to do with it, and what has she?" It could hardly have been the words, for I didn't understand them. It must have been the tone he spoke in, I suppose, that made me feel a momentary tremor. I was half inclined, without the ghost of a reason for it, to wish him good night and go in again. Not much like me, you will say. Not much indeed. It didn't last a moment. Your darling Lydia soon came to her senses again. I led the way toward the unfinished cottages and the country beyond. It would have been much more to my taste to have had him into the house and have talked to him in the light of the candles. But I had risked it once already, and in this scandal-mongering place, and in my critical position, I was afraid to risk it again. The garden was not to be thought of either, for the landlord smokes his pipe there after supper. There was no alternative but to take him away from the town. From time to time I looked back as I went on. There he was, always at the same distance, dim and ghost-like in the dusk, silently following me. I must leave off for a little while. The church bells have broken out, and the jangling of them drives me mad. In these days, when we have all got watches and clocks, why are bells wanted to remind us when the service begins? We don't require to be rung into the theatre. How excessively discreditable to the clergy to be obliged to ring us into the church! They have rung the congregation in at last, and I can take up my pen and go on again. I was in a little doubt where to lead him to, The high road was on one side of me, but empty as it looked, somebody might be passing when we least expected it. The other way was through the coppice. I led him through the coppice. At the outskirts of the trees, on the other side, there was a dip in the ground with some felled timber lying on it, and a little pool beyond, still and white and shining in the twilight. The long grazing grounds rose over its further shore, with the mist thickening on them, and a dim black line far away of cattle in slow procession going home. There wasn't a living creature near. There wasn't a sound to be heard. I sat down on one of the felled trees and looked back for him. "Come," I said softly. "Come and sit by me here." Why am I so particular about all this? I hardly know. The place made an unaccountably vivid impression on me, and I can't help writing about it. If I end badly, suppose we say on the scaffold, I believe the last thing I shall see, before the hangman pulls the drop, will be the little shining pool, and the long misty grazing grounds, and the cattle winding dimly home in the thickening night. Don't be alarmed, you worthy creature. My fancies play me strange tricks sometimes, and there is a little of last night's laudanum, I dare say, in this part of my letter. He came, in the strangest silent way, like a man walking in his sleep. He came and sat down by me. Either the night was very close, or I was by this time literally in a fever. I couldn't bear my bonnet on. I couldn't bear my gloves. The want to look at him and see what his singular silence meant, and the impossibility of doing it in the darkening light, irritated my nerves, till I thought I should have screamed. I took his hand, to try if that would help me. It was burning hot, and it closed instantly on mine. You know how. Silence after that was not to be thought of. The one safe way was to begin talking to him at once. "Don't despise me," I said. "I am obliged to bring you to this lonely place. I should lose my character if we were seen together." I waited a little. His hand warned me once more not to let the silence continue. I determined to make him speak to me this time. "You have interested me and frightened me," I went on. "You have written me a very strange letter. I must know what it means." "It is too late to ask. You have taken the way, and I have taken the way, from which there is no turning back." He made that strange answer in a tone that was quite new to me, a tone that made me even more uneasy than his silence had made me the moment before. "Too late," he repeated, "too late. There is only one question to ask me now." "What is it?" As I said the words, a sudden trembling passed from his hand to mine, and told me instantly that I had better have held my tongue. Before I could move, before I could think, he had me in his arms. "Ask me if I love you," he whispered. At the same moment his head sank on my bosom, and some unutterable torture that was in him burst its way out, as it does with us, in a passion of sobs and tears. My first impulse was the impulse of a fool. I was on the point of making our usual protest and defending myself in our usual way. Luckily or unluckily, I don't know which, I have lost the fine edge of the sensitiveness of youth, and I checked the first movement of my hands and the first word on my lips. Oh dear, how old I felt, while he was sobbing his heart out on my breast. How I thought of the time when he might have possessed himself of my love. All he had possessed himself of now was my waist. I wonder whether I pitied him. It doesn't matter if I did. At any rate, my hand lifted itself somehow, and my fingers twined themselves softly in his hair. Horrible recollections came back to me of other times, and made me shudder as I touched him. and yet I did it. What fools women are! "I won't reproach you," I said gently. "I won't say this is a cruel advantage to take of me in such a position as mine. You are dreadfully agitated. I will let you wait a little and compose yourself." Having got as far as that, I stopped to consider how I should put the questions to him that I was burning to ask. But I was too confused, I suppose, or perhaps too impatient to consider. I let out what was uppermost in my mind, in the words that came first. "I don't believe you love me," I said. "You write strange things to me. You frighten me with mysteries. What did you mean by saying in your letter that it would be fatal to Mr. Armadale if you came back to me? What danger can there be to Mr. Armadale?" Before I could finish the question he suddenly lifted his head and unclasped his arms. I had apparently touched some painful subject which recalled him to himself. Instead of my shrinking from him, it was he who shrank from me. I felt offended with him. Why, I don't know, but offended I was, and I thanked him with my bitterest emphasis for remembering what was due to me at last. "Do you believe in dreams?" he burst out in the most strangely abrupt manner, without taking the slightest notice of what I had said to him. "Tell me," he went on, without allowing me time to answer, "were you or was any relation of yours ever connected with Allan Armadale's father or mother? Were you or was anybody belonging to you ever in the island of Madeira?" Conceive my astonishment, if you can. I turned cold. In an instant I turned cold all over. He was plainly in the secret of what had happened when I was in Mrs. Armadale's service in Madeira. In all probability before he was born. That was startling enough of itself, and he had evidently some reason of his own for trying to connect me with those events, which was more startling still. "No," I said, as soon as I could trust myself to speak, "I know nothing of his father or mother." "And nothing of the island of Madeira?" "Nothing of the island of Madeira." He turned his head away and began talking to himself. "Strange," he said. "As certainly as I was in the shadow's place at the window, she was in the shadow's place at the pool." Under other circumstances his extraordinary behaviour might have alarmed me, but after his question about Madeira there was some greater fear in me which kept all common alarm at a distance. I don't think I ever determined on anything in my life as I determined on finding out how he had got his information, and who he really was. It was quite plain to me that I had roused some hidden feeling in him by my question about Armadale, which was as strong in its way as his feeling for me. What had become of my influence over him? I couldn't imagine what had become of it, but I could and did set to work to make him feel it again. "Don't treat me cruelly," I said. "I didn't treat you cruelly just now. Oh, Mr. Midwinter, it's so lonely, it's so dark. Don't frighten me." "Frighten you?" He was close to me again in a moment. "Frighten you?" He repeated the word with as much astonishment as if I had woke him from a dream, and charged him with something he had said in his sleep. It was on the tip of my tongue, finding how I had surprised him, to take him while he was off his guard, and to ask why my question about Armadale had produced such a change in his behaviour to me. But after what had happened already, I was afraid to risk returning to the subject too soon. Something or other, what they call an instinct, I dare say, warned me to let Armadale alone for the present, and to talk to him first about himself. As I told you in one of my early letters, I had noticed signs and tokens in his manner and appearance which convinced me, young as he was, that he had done something or suffered something out of the common in his past life. I had asked myself more and more suspiciously every time I saw him whether he was what he appeared to be, and first and foremost among my other doubts was a doubt whether he was passing among us by his real name. Having secrets to keep about my own past life, and having gone myself in other days by more than one assumed name, I suppose I am all the readier to suspect other people when I find something mysterious about them. Anyway, having the suspicion in my mind, I determined to startle him, as he had startled me, by an unexpected question on my side, a question about his name. While I was thinking, he was thinking, and as it soon appeared, of what I had just said to him. "I am so grieved to have frightened you," he whispered, with that gentleness and humility which we all so heartily despise in a man when he speaks to other women, and which we all so dearly like when he speaks to ourselves. "I hardly know what I have been saying," he went on. "My mind is miserably disturbed. Pray forgive me if you can. I am not myself tonight." "I am not angry," I said. "I have nothing to forgive. We are both imprudent. We are both unhappy." I laid my head on his shoulder. "Do you really love me?" I asked him softly, in a whisper. His arm stole round me again, and I felt the quick beat of his heart get quicker and quicker. "If you only knew," he whispered back. "If you only knew." He could say no more. I felt his face bending towards mine, and dropped my head lower, and stopped him in the very act of kissing me. "No," I said. "I am only a woman who has taken your fancy. You are treating me as if I was your promised wife." "Be my promised wife," he whispered eagerly, and tried to raise my head. I kept it down. The horror of these old remembrances that you know of came back and made me tremble a little when he asked me to be his wife. I don't think I was actually faint, but something like faintness made me close my eyes. The moment I shut them, the darkness seemed to open as if lightning had split it, and the ghosts of those other men rose in the horrid gap and looked at me. "Speak to me," he whispered tenderly. "My darling, my angel, speak to me." His voice helped me to recover myself. I had just sense enough left to remember that the time was passing, and that I had not put my question to him yet about his name. "Suppose I felt for you as you feel for me," I said. "Suppose I loved you dearly enough to trust you with the happiness of all my life to come." I paused for a moment to get my breath. It was still unbearably still and close. The air seemed to have died when the night came. "Would you be marrying me honourably," I went on, "if you married me in your present name?" His arm dropped from my waist, and I felt him give one great start. After that he sat by me, still and cold and silent, as if my question had struck him dumb. I put my arm round his neck, and lifted my head again on his shoulder. Whatever the spell was I had laid on him, my coming closer in that way seemed to break it. "Who told you?" He stopped. "No," he went on. "Nobody can have told you. What made you suspect?" He stopped again. "Nobody told me," I said, "and I don't know what made me suspect. Women have strange fancies sometimes. Is Midwinter really your name?" "I can't deceive you," he answered, after another interval of silence. "Midwinter is not really my name." I nestled a little closer to him. "What is your name?" I asked. He hesitated. I lifted my face till my cheek just touched his. I persisted, with my lips close at his ear. What, no confidence in me even yet? No confidence in the woman who has almost confessed she loves you? Who has almost consented to be your wife?" He turned his face to mine. For the second time he tried to kiss me, and for the second time I stopped him. "If I tell you my name," he said, "I must tell you more." I let my cheek touch his again. "Why not?" I said. "How can I love a man, much less marry him, if he keeps himself a stranger to me?" There was no answering that, as I thought. But he did answer it. "It is a dreadful story," he said. "It may darken all your life if you know it, as it has darkened mine." I put my other arm around him and persisted. "Tell it me. I am not afraid. Tell it me." He began to yield to my other arm. "Will you keep it a sacred secret?" he said. "Never to be breathed, never to be known but to you and me?" I promised him it should be a secret. I waited in a perfect frenzy of expectation. Twice he tried to begin, and twice his courage failed him. "I can't," he broke out in a wild, helpless way. "I can't tell it." My curiosity, or more likely my temper, got beyond control. He had irritated me till I was reckless what I said or what I did. I suddenly clasped him close and pressed my lips to his. "I love you," I whispered in a kiss. "Now will you tell me?" For the moment he was speechless. I don't know whether I did it purposely to drive him wild. I don't know whether I did it involuntarily in a burst of rage. Nothing is certain but that I interpreted his silence the wrong way. I pushed him back from me in a fury, the instant after I had kissed him. "I hate you," I said. "You have maddened me into forgetting myself. Leave me. I don't care for the darkness. Leave me instantly and never see me again." He caught me by the hand and stopped me. He spoke in a new voice. He suddenly commanded, as only men can. "Sit down," he said. "You have given me back my courage. You shall know who I am." In the silence and the darkness all around us I obeyed him, and sat down. In the silence and the darkness all round us he took me in his arms again, and told me who he was. Shall I trust you with his story? Shall I tell you his real name? Shall I show you, as I threatened, the thoughts that have grown out of my interview with him and out of all that has happened to me since that time? Or shall I keep his secret as I promised, and keep my own secret too, by bringing this weary, long letter to an end at the very moment when you are burning to hear more? Those are serious questions, Mrs. Oldershaw, more serious than you suppose. I have had time to calm down, and I begin to see what I failed to see when I first took up my pen to write to you, the wisdom of looking at consequences. Have I frightened myself in trying to frighten you? It is possible. Strange as it may seem, it is really possible. I have been at the window for the last minute or two, thinking. There is plenty of time for thinking before the post leaves. The people are only now coming out of church. I have settled to put my letter on one side and to take a look at my diary. In plainer words, I must see what I risk if I decide on trusting you, and my diary will show me what my head is too weary to calculate without help. I have written the story of my days, sometimes the story of my nights, much more regularly than usual for the last week, having reasons of my own for being particularly careful in this respect under present circumstances. If I end in doing what is now in my mind to do, It would be madness to trust to my memory. The smallest forgetfulness of the slightest event that has happened from the night of my interview with Midwinter to the present time might be utter ruin to me. Utter ruin to her, you will say. What kind of ruin does she mean? Wait a little, till I have asked my diary whether I can safely tell you. End of Book the Third, Chapter 9. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey.
Chapter 10, Part 1 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Magdalena Cook. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 10, Part 1. Miss Gwilt's Diary. July 21st, Monday night, 11 o'clock. Midwinter has just left me. We parted by my desire at the path out of the coppice. He is going his way to the hotel, and I am going to mine to my lodgings. I have managed to avoid making another appointment with him by arranging to write to him tomorrow morning. This gives me the night's interval to compose myself, and to coax my mind back, if I can, to my own affairs. Will the night pass, and the morning find me still thinking of the letter that came to him from his father's deathbed, of the night he watched through on the wrecked ship, and more than all, of the first breathless moment when he told me his real name? Would it help me to shake off these impressions, I wonder, if I made the effort of writing them down? There would be no danger, in that case, of my forgetting anything important. And perhaps, after all, it may be the fear of forgetting something which I ought to remember, that keeps this story of Midwinter's weighing as it does on my mind. At any rate, the experiment is worth trying. In my present situation, I must be free to think of other things, or I shall never find my way through all the difficulties at Thorpe Ambrose that are still to come. Let me think. What haunts me, to begin with? The names haunt me. I keep saying and saying to myself, both alike, Christian name and surname both alike. A light-haired Allan Armadale, whom I have long since known of, and who is the son of my old mistress. A dark-haired Allan Armadale, whom I only know of now, and who is only known to others under the name of Ozias Midwinter. Stranger still, it is not relationship, it is not chance, that has made them namesakes. The father of the light Armadale was the man who was born to the family name, and who lost the family inheritance. The father of the dark Armadale was the man who took the name on condition of getting the inheritance, and who got it. So there are two of them. I can't help thinking of it, both unmarried. The light-haired Armadale, who offers to the woman who can secure him 8,000 a year while he lives, who leaves her 1,200 a year when he dies, who must and shall marry me for those two golden reasons, and whom I hate and loathe as I never hated and loathed a man yet. And the dark-haired Armadale, who has a poor little income, which might perhaps pay his wife's milliner, if his wife was careful, who has just left me, persuaded that I mean to marry him, and whom I might have loved once, before I was the woman I am now. And Allan the Fair doesn't know he has a namesake, and Allan the Dark has kept the secret from everybody but the Somersetshire clergyman, whose discretion he can depend on, and myself. And there are two Allan Armadales. 2 Allan Armadales. 2 Allan Armadales. There, 3 is a lucky number. Haunt me again after that if you can. What next? The murder in the timber ship. No, the murder is a good reason why the dark Armadale, whose father committed it, should keep his secret from the fair Armadale, whose father was killed. But it doesn't concern me. I remember there was a suspicion in Madeira at the time of something wrong. Was it wrong? Was the man who had been tricked out of his wife to blame for shutting the cabin door, and leaving the man who had tricked him to drown in the wreck? Yes, the woman wasn't worth it. What am I sure of that really concerns myself? I am sure of one very important thing. I am sure that Midwinter, I must call him by his ugly false name, or I may confuse the two Armadales before I have done. I am sure that Midwinter is perfectly ignorant that I and the little imp of 12 years old, who waited on Mrs. Armadale in Madeira, and copied the letters that were supposed to arrive from the West Indies, are one and the same. There are not many girls of 12 who could have imitated a man's handwriting, and held their tongues about it afterward, as I did. But that doesn't matter now. What does matter is that Midwinter's belief in the dream is Midwinter's only reason for trying to connect with me and Allan Armadale, by associating me with Allan Armadale's father and mother. I asked him if he actually thought me old enough to have known either of them, and he said no, poor fellow, in the most innocent, bewildered way. Would he say no if he saw me now? Shall I turn to the glass and see if I look my 35 years, or shall I go on writing? I will go on writing. There is one thing more that haunts me almost as obstinately as the names. I wonder whether I am right in relying on Midwinter's superstition, as I do, to help me in keeping him at arm's length. After having let the excitement of the moment hurry me into saying more than I need have said, he is certain to press me, he is certain to come back, with a man's hateful selfishness and impatience in such things, to question of marrying me. Will the dream help me check him? After alternately believing and disbelieving in it, he has got, by his own confession, to believing in it again. Can I say I believe in it too? I have better reasons for doing so than he knows of. I am not the only person who helped Mrs. Armadale's marriage by helping her to impose on her own father. I am the woman who tried to drown herself, the woman who started the series of accidents which put young Armadale in possession of his fortune, the woman who has come Thorpe Ambrose to marry him for his fortune. Now he has got it. And more extraordinary still, the woman who stood in the Shadow's place at the pool. These may be coincidences, but they are strange coincidences. I declare I begin to fancy that I believe in the dream too. Suppose I say to him, I think as you think. I say what you said in your letter to me. Let us part before the harm is done. Leave me before the third vision of the dream comes true. Leave me, and put the mountains and the seas between you and the man who bears your name. Suppose on the other side that his love for me makes him reckless of everything else. Suppose he says those desperate words again which I understand now. What is to be, will be. What have I to do with it? And what is she? Suppose... I won't write any more. I hate writing. It doesn't relieve me. It makes me worse. I'm further from being able to think of all that I must think of, than I was when I sat down. It is past midnight. Tomorrow has come already, and here I am as helpless as the stupidest woman living. Bed is the only fit place for me. Bed! If it was 10 years since, instead of today, and if I had married Midwinter for love, I might be going to bed now with nothing heavier on my mind than a visit on tiptoe to the nursery, and a last look at night to see if my children were sleeping quietly in their cribs. I wonder whether I should have loved my children if I had ever had any. Perhaps. Yes, perhaps. No, it doesn't matter. Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock. Who was the man who invented laudanum? I thank him from the bottom of my heart, whoever he is. If all the miserable wretches in pain of body and mind, whose comforter he has been, could meet together to sing his praises, what a chorus it would be! I have had 6 delicious hours of oblivion. I have woke up with my mind composed. I have written a perfect little letter to Midwinter. I have drunk my nice cup of tea, with a real relish of it. I have dawdled over my morning toilet with an exquisite sense of relief. And all through the modest little bottle of drops which I see on my bedroom chimney-piece at this moment. Drops, you are a darling. If I love nothing else, I love you. My letter to Midwinter has been sent through the post, and I have told him to reply to me in the same manner. I feel no anxiety about his answer. He can only answer in one way. I have asked for a little time to consider, because my family circumstances require some consideration, in his interests as well as in mine. I have engaged to tell him what those circumstances are. What shall I say, I wonder, when we meet next? And I have requested him in the meantime to keep all that has passed between us a secret for the present. As to what he is to do himself in the interval, while I am supposed to be considering, I have left it to his own discretion, merely reminding him that his attempting to see me again, while our positions towards each other cannot be openly avowed, might injure my reputation. I have offered to write to him if he wishes it, and I have ended by promising to make the interval of our necessary separation as short as I can. This sort of plain, unaffected letter, which I might have written to him last night, if his story had not been running in my head as it did, has one defect, I know. It certainly keeps him out of the way while I am casting my net and catching my goldfish at the great house for the second time, but it also leaves an awkward day of reckoning to come with Midwinter if I succeed. How am I to manage him? What am I to do? I ought to face those two questions as boldly as usual, but somehow my courage seems to fail me, and I don't quite fancy meeting that difficulty, till the time comes when it must be met. Shall I confess to my diary that I am sorry for Midwinter, and that I shrink a little from thinking of the day when he hears that I am going to be mistress at the great house? But I am not mistress yet, and I can't take a step in that direction of the great house till I have got the answer to my letter, and till I know that Midwinter is out of the way. Patience, patience. I must go and forget myself at my piano. There is the Moonlight Sonata open and tempting me on the music-stand. Have I nerve enough to play it, I wonder? Or will it set me shuddering with the mystery and terror of it, as it did the other day? 5 o'clock. I have got his answer. The slightest request I can make is a command to him. He has gone, and he sends me his address in London. There are 2 considerations, he says, which help to reconcile me to leaving you. The first is that you wish it, and that is only to be for a little while. The second is that I think I can make some arrangements in London for adding to my income by my own labour. I have never cared for money for myself, but you don't know how I am beginning already to prize the luxuries and refinements that money can provide, for my wife's sake. Poor fellow! I almost wish I had not written to him as I did. I almost wish I had not sent him away from me. Fancy if Mother Oldershaw saw this page in my diary! I have had a letter from her this morning, a letter to remind me of my obligations, and to tell me she suspects things are all going wrong. Let her suspect. I shan't trouble myself to answer. I can't be worried with that old wretch in the state I am in now. It is a lovely afternoon. I want a walk. I mustn't think of Midwinter. Suppose I put on my bonnet and try my experiment at once at the great house? Everything is in my favour. There is no spy to follow me, and no lawyer to keep me out, this time. Am I handsome enough to-day? Well, yes, handsome enough to be a match for a little dowdy, awkward, freckled creature, or to be perched on a form at school, and strapped to a backboard to straighten her crooked shoulders. The nursery lisps out in all they utter. Besides, they always smell of bread and butter. How admirably Byron has described girls in their teens. 8 o'clock. I have just got back from Armadale's house. I have seen him and spoken to him, and the end of it may be set down in 3 plain words. I have failed. There is no more chance of my being Mrs. Armadale of Thorpe Ambrose than there is of me being Queen of England. Shall I write and tell Oldershaw? Shall I go back to London? Not till I have had time to think a little. Not just yet. Let me think. I have failed completely. Failed, with all the circumstances in favour of success. I caught him alone on the drive in front of the house. He was excessively disconcerted, but at the same time quite willing to hear me. I tried him, first quietly, then with tears, and the rest of it. I introduced myself in the character of the poor innocent woman whom he had been the means of injuring. I confused, I interested, I convinced him. I went on the purely Christian part of my errand, and spoke with such feeling of his separation from his friend, for which I was innocently responsible, that I turned his odious rosy face quite pale, and made him beg me at last not to distress him. But whatever other feelings I roused in him, I never once roused his old feeling for me. I saw it in his eyes when he looked at me, I felt it in his fingers when we shook hands. We parted friends, and nothing more. It is for this, is it, Miss Milroy, that I resisted temptation, morning after morning, when I knew you were out alone in the park? I have just left you time to slip in and take my place in Armadale's good graces, have I? I never resisted temptation yet without suffering for it in some such way as this. If I had only followed my first thoughts on the day when I took leave of you, my young lady. Well, well, never mind that now. I have got the future before me. You are not Mrs. Armadale yet. And I can tell you one other thing. Whoever else he marries, he will never marry you. If I am even with you in no other way, trust me, whatever comes of it, to be even with you there. I am not, to my own surprise, in one of my furious passions. The last time I was in this perfectly cool state, under serious provocation, something came of it, which I daren't write down, even in my own private diary. I shouldn't be surprised if something comes of it now. On my way back I called at Mr. Bashwood's lodgings in the town. He was not at home, and I left a message telling him to come here tonight and speak to me. I mean to relieve him at once of the duty of looking after Armadale and Miss Milroy. I may not see my way yet to ruining her prospects at Thorpe Ambrose as completely as she has ruined mine, but when the time comes, and I do see it, I don't know to what lengths my sense of injury may take me, and there may be inconvenience, and possibly danger, in having such a chicken-hearted creature as Mr. Bashwood in my confidence. I suspect I am more upset by all this than I supposed. Midwinter's story is beginning to haunt me again, without rhyme or reason. A soft, quick, trembling knock at the street door. I know who it is. No hand but old Bashwood's could knock in that way. 9 o'clock. I have just got rid of him. He has surprised me by coming out in a new character. It seems, though I didn't detect him, he was at the great house while I was in company with Armadale. He saw us talking on the drive, and he afterward heard what the servants said, who saw us too. The wise opinion below stairs is that we have made it up, and that the master is likely to marry me after all. "He's sweet on her red hair," was the elegant expression they used in the kitchen. "Little Missy can't match her there, and little Missy will get the worst of it." How I hate the coarse ways of the lower orders! While old Bashwood was telling me this, I thought he looked even more confused and nervous than usual, but I failed to see what was really the matter until after I had told him that he was to leave all further observation of Mr. Armadale and Miss Milroy to me. Every drop of the little blood there is in the feeble old creature's body seemed to fly up into his face. He made quite an overpowering effort. He really looked as if he would drop down dead of fright at his own boldness. But he forced out the question for all that, stammering and stuttering and kneading desperately with both hands at the brim of his hideous great hat. "I beg your pardon, Miss Gwilt. You are not really going to marry Mr. Armadale, are you?" Jealous, if I ever saw it in a man's face yet. I saw it in his. Actually jealous of Armadale at his age! If I had been in the humour for it, I should have burst out laughing in his face. As it was, I was angry, and lost all patience with him. I told him he was an old fool, and ordered him to go on quietly with his usual business until I sent word that he was wanted again. He submitted as usual, but there was an indescribable something in his watery old eyes when he took leave of me, which I have never noticed in them before. Love has the credit of working all sorts of strange transformations. Can it be really possible that love has made Mr. Bashwood man enough to be angry with me? Wednesday. My experience of Miss Milroy's habits suggested a suspicion to me last night which I thought it desirable to clear up this morning. It was always her way, when I was at the cottage, to take a walk early in the morning before breakfast, considering that I used often to choose that very time for my private meetings with Armadale. It struck me as likely that my former pupil might be taking a leaf out of my book, and that I might make some desirable discoveries if I turned my steps in the direction of the Major's garden at the right hour. I deprived myself of my drops, to make sure of waking, passed a miserable night in consequence, and was ready enough to get up at 6 o'clock and walk the distance from my lodgings to the cottage in the fresh morning air. I had not been 5 minutes on the park side of the garden enclosure before I said her come out. She seemed to have had a bad night too. Her eyes were heavy and red, and her lips and cheeks looked swollen as if she had been crying. There was something on her mind evidently, something, as it soon appeared, to take her out of the garden into the park. She walked, if one can call it walking with such legs as hers, straight to the summer house, and opened the door, and crossed the bridge, and went on quicker and quicker toward the low ground in the park, where the trees are thickest. I followed her over the open space with perfect impunity in the preoccupied state she was in, and, when she began to slacken her pace among the trees, I was among the trees too, and was not afraid of her seeing me. Before long there was a crackling and trampling of heavy feet coming up towards us through the underwood in a deep dip of the ground. I knew that step as well as she knew it. "Here I am," she said in a faint little voice. I kept behind the trees a few yards off, in some doubt on which side Armadale would come out of the underwood to join her. He came out up the side of the dell, opposite to the tree behind which I was standing. They sat down together on the bank. I sat down behind the tree, and looked at them through the underwood, and heard without the slightest difficulty every word that they said. The talk began by his noticing that she looked out of spirits, and asking if anything had gone wrong at the cottage. The artful little minx lost no time in making the necessary impression on him. She began to cry. He took her hand, of course, and tried in his brutishly straightforward way to comfort her. No, she was not to be comforted. A miserable prospect was before her. She had not slept the whole night for thinking of it. Her father had called her into his room the previous evening, had spoken about the state of her education, and had told her in so many words that she was to go to school. The place had been found, and the terms had been settled, and as soon as her clothes could be got ready, Miss was to go. "While that hateful Miss Gwilt was in my house," says this model young person, "I would have gone to school willingly. I wanted to go. But it's all different now. I don't think of it in the same way. I feel too old for school. I'm quite heartbroken, Mr. Armadale." There she stopped, as if she had meant to say more, and gave him a look which finished the sentence plainly. "I'm quite heartbroken, Mr. Armadale, now we are friendly again, at going away from you. For downright brazen impudence, which a grown woman would be ashamed of. Give me the young girls whose modesty is so pertinaciously insisted on by the nauseous domestic sentimentalist of the present day." Even Armadale, booby as he is, understood her. After bewildering himself in a labyrinth of words that led nowhere, he took her, one can hardly say round the waist, for she hasn't got one. He took her round the last hook and eye of her dress, and by way of offering her a refuge from the indignity of being sent to school at her age, made her a proposal of marriage in so many words. If I could have killed them both at that moment by lifting up my little finger, I have not the least doubt that I should have lifted it. As things were, I only waited to see what Miss Milroy would do. She appeared to think it necessary, feeling, I suppose, that she had met him without her father's knowledge, and not forgetting that I had had the start of her as the favourite object of Mr. Armadale's good opinion, to assert herself by an explosion of virtuous indignation. She wondered how he could think of such a thing after his conduct with Miss Gwilt, and after her father had forbidden him the house. Did he want to make her feel how inexcusably she had forgotten what was due to herself? Was it worthy of a gentleman to propose what he knew as well as she did was impossible? And so on, and so on. Any man with brains in his head would have known what all this rhodomontade really meant. Armadale took it so seriously that he actually attempted to justify himself. He declared, in his headlong, blundering way, that he was quite in earnest. He and her father might make it up and be friends again, and, if the Major persisted in treating him as a stranger, young ladies and gentlemen in their situation had made runaway marriages before now, and fathers and mothers who wouldn't forgive them before had forgiven them afterward. Such outrageously straightforward love-making as this left Miss Milroy, of course, but two alternatives: to confess that she had been saying no when she meant yes, or to take refuge in another explosion. She was hypocrite enough to prefer another explosion. "How dare you, Mr. Armadale? Go away directly. It's inconsiderate, it's heartless, it's perfectly disgraceful to say such things to me," and so on, and so on. It seems incredible, but it is not the less true, that he was positively fool enough to take her at her word. He begged her pardon, and went away like a child that is put in the corner, the most contemptible object in the form of a man that eyes ever looked on. She waited after he had gone to compose herself, and I waited behind the trees to see how she would succeed. Her eyes wandered round slyly to the path by which he had left her. She smiled, grinned would be the truer way of putting it with such a mouth as hers, took a few steps on tiptoe to look after him, turned back again, and suddenly burst into a violent fit of crying. I am not quite so easily taken in as Armadale, and I saw what it all meant plainly enough. "To-morrow," I thought to myself, "you will be in the park again, miss, by pure accident. The next day you will lead him on into proposing to you for the second time. The day after he will venture back to the subject of runaway marriages, and you will only be becomingly confused. And the day after that, if he has got a plan to propose, and if your clothes are ready to be packed for school, you will listen to him. Yes, yes, time is always on the man's side, where a woman is concerned, if the man is only patient enough to let time help him." I let her leave the place and go back to the cottage, quite unconscious that I had been looking at her. I waited among the trees, thinking. The truth is, I was impressed by what I had heard and seen, in a manner that is not very easy to describe. I put the whole thing before me in a new light. It showed me, what I had never even suspected till this morning, that she is really fond of him. Heavy as my debt of obligation is to her, there is no fear now of my failing to pay it to the last farthing. It would have been no small triumph for me to stand between Miss Milroy and her ambition to be one of the leading ladies of the county. But it is infinitely more where her first love is concerned, to stand between Miss Milroy and her heart's desire. Shall I remember my own youth and spare her? No. She has deprived me of the one chance I had of breaking the chain that binds me to a past life too horrible to be thought of. I am thrown back into a position, compared to which the position of an outcast who walks the streets is endurable and enviable. No, Miss Milroy, no, Mr. Armadale, I will spare neither of you. End of Chapter 10, Part 1.